we're ready to go with Dakota. Here we go. And the second was in my conversation with Frank Figluzzi the other night, I referenced an article that, not an article, sorry, a report I made in summer of 2020 about groups that were very likely to be violent in the election, and they were talking differently than just being pissed off. So, one second. Sorry, giving some messages to our support guys here. And it was called the Boog Threat, and I ran it through Claude AI with a very specific prompt that I've developed about retroactive reports, knowing that they've been hand done. Hey, Dakota's here, so you'll appreciate this. I was talking about a report I wrote about groups in summer 2020, and I ran it through Claude AI, and I wanted two parts of it. I wanted to assess how accurate it was in hindsight, and what it missed. And what it missed is what we're gonna talk about tonight. Where did it miss the boat? And then the second part was an intel gap assessment, and or information gap assessment. Like what is not in this that we need to know that's evolved over now 6 years. It was pretty good. It's not good news. The biggest one was the Department of Justice failure. It highlighted that the writer in the summer of 2020 could not have foreseen that the Department of Justice would have said, "Nah, no crime." So, yeah. On that note, what perfect timing to have you arrive and I haven't put the report out. I just ran it through to see what I would get, and it was not good. How are you doing, my brother? Good to see you.
Oh, I'm doing just fine. And let me know if the microphone is coming through okay.
Yeah, perfectly good. And we're gonna let some of our friends join in still because we're a hair early. Uh, but I'm glad you're jumped in here. Give the people a chance to see how you're doing because I was actually glad to see you had an account on here. Just needs some good voicing from you so that people will come along and sign up and
Yep, well, I've long neglected my poor Substack while I've been busy with other stuff, so I very much appreciate the true faithful who are still subscribed after all this time.
yeah. It's a
But
good
it's
platform
time to
compared to
start it up again.
yeah, well the toxicity of the other platforms is a real big problem. And it's something that was discouraging me until some really amazing voices that talk about topics that affect you um, show up here. And when I saw that the crowd was very tuned in, they're very informed, which makes it a lot easier to have a better conversation in many ways. Um, and they're eager to hear what's going on. So especially with you and people who've got the most close-up experience that they want instead of that kind of CNN 8 minutes of here's what happened today. Okay, now sports.
Now sports.
Yeah, or the Oscars. So we have some people that have joined in by now, and they'll see an audio recording of this later, or a YouTube or something. Also, one more thing about Substack I really like is it co-creates, meaning everything we talk about with any guest, and same thing if you host a guest or vice versa, both accounts get to have that communication to share for messaging that's important to the community at large and to each of their missions and needs. And I know in your case, what makes it different is this is for real. I mean, this isn't something just in the headline. This has been all your life, too much of your life, in a capacity that most people could relate to.
Yep, and aside from what I've talked about before, in there being a very brief window where I call it in retrospect, my neoliberal phase, which is
Hmm.
the year that I from like 2016 to 2017,
Hmm.
right after I voted for Trump the first time around, actually, because I believed in Pizzagate, where I
Hmm.
was doing it basically for centrist neoliberal reasons, which is I just wanted everything to be kind of okay so that I
Hmm.
wouldn't have to bother with worrying about the future.
Right.
And aside from that, it's a somewhat more positive return to the expectations I was raised in of just being born into a time of struggle for the soul of the country. And I just was raised with a flawed version of the facts of that struggle that I have now corrected as best I can as a grown man.
Um, I I think that one of the things I've learned most about you was that there was one part that the person who happened to be your, male parental person, was putting in place a model that eventually was your integrity that I see now. But it was sort of regimented as part of your upbringing, and later became a thing that it undid the guy who was all, I'm the big patriot. You're the patriot in the family, aside from others. I love your mom, but that's an ironic twist that I think turned out for the good in you. I've seen you we've known each other for a while, so.
Yep. And in that, there is this weird effect of I don't know how many of so I refer to Stewart as my father because like biological father is a legal term. Use sperm
Okay.
donor when I'm being spicy. So an odd thing about Stewart Rhodes is that I will never know how many of his speeches or turns of phrase
Mm,
or how much of what he would say even in conversation with us was original to him and how
mhm,
much was copied from something else because one thing I've come to understand as an adult, which is going to feed into talking about the decline of Oath Keepers and where things stand now with the
right.
Department of Justice attempt to airlift Stewart out of the consequences of his own actions, is that Stewart has had very few original thoughts, I think, in his entire life. But what he is amazing at is copying. And this was true even of his art career, where he was fantastic at copying. And thank you very much, Robin White, for the props overseeing me on mainstream media. He was fantastic at copying, even when it came to uh, sculptures from references in art books, where he was able to precisely copy
Mm,
intricate photorealistic sculptures and art styles, but he never had his own independently derived art style in painting or in sculpture. He could only replicate, and he could replicate very, very well and seamlessly. And he did the exact same thing with his persona. And
mhm,
he was always, always on, even in the home, even when it was just us and there was no other audience to perform for, he was portraying a character with
mhm,
traits that he had picked up from somewhere else. So, what I got in my childhood that was so at odds with the rest of his behavior was that part of the time Stewart would be mimicking the behaviors and professed ideals of patriots and men with integrity and would be
Hold on, losing your signal there. We got your signal. Everyone else, I'm not catching. Bear with us. Let's see. Message over on our end. Oh, lost him. Hold on. Bear with me. We're still here on our end. We'll just get reset. There we go. All good. Let's see. I get your icon. Okay, hold on. Let's see what's up. We have time. We have time for this. That's the beauty of doing it this way. There we go. All right, we back.
Yeah.
Okay, good. Go ahead. Continue. Sorry.
Oh, just that. Restate the last bit if it didn't get caught. That the what was transmitted to me was the perfect mimicry of
A
men of
patriot.
high ideals and patriotism, integrity,
Yeah.
honor. And once I understood that Stewart was always portraying a character and never believed in it, it was easier to reconcile the contradictions of my childhood and made it not very surprising to see what became of Stewart when, like with so much of the rest of the country, Trump allowed him to let that facade fall. And
Hmm.
he really was all along on the inside. The great permission.
Yeah. There's nothing there, right? Or it's an unknown at least.
Yeah, very like a like growing up in a household with a philosophical zombie for those who are like familiar with the concept. A person who does not have true consciousness of their own, but is so able to mimic human behavior that you generally can't tell the difference.
It brings me to impulsively ask a chance to learn right here with you. In your transformation from those days where you're waking up from then till now, how how many of those things did you really delve into as a way of like crawling your way out of that hole? Like these various psychological terms, some of the sociological terms, because I have some of my own. As you know, I went through a different situation, but when I hear things go, oh yeah, yeah, that, and it helped me a lot. So talk about a little bit that transformation before we go into sort of where we're at.
Well, it was very useful to find the language to describe what I'd been dealing with, and I found a lot of the most useful language in the memoirs of people who had left high control religions, had left
Mm,
cults,
hmm.
and other extremist political movements. And there's there's a because the US like patriot militia movement is has so much overlap and in common with the religious evangelical movement that
Hmm.
is also the foundation of Trumpism,
Hmm.
alongside the more secular, militant conspiracy theory aspect of it. There is a commonality where you are just directly trained to not examine the contradictions and the hypocrisy, where there are not very many people like, again, survivors of cults around the world
Hmm.
would be able to identify with it. But in contemporary America, it has mostly been former evangelicals
Hmm.
who have offered the language that was the most useful to me in untangling my own past, despite the fact that my upbringing was uh, largely secular and non religious, and theirs was extraordinarily religious. But
Sure.
the authoritarian right wing culture underlying it was very much the same, and the mechanisms were the same. How it was the same. And
Yeah.
I'll get to where I am now. It is the language of reconstructed evangelical Christians, ex evangelicals, people who have left cult movements like the IBLP, the Douglas Church,
Hmm. Oh yeah.
that have offered the most that I've found useful.
In the transformation of Stewart in front of you, although there's obviously the track that's always been there, Is the guy who was there from when you were born on. Um, can you remember some timelines that stick out if you were to look at eras of his role around you? And specifically, the reason why I ask, the more fame that came in when he would do those musters, which I have all those recordings, by the way. I'm weird, bro. I have all those recordings here on my desktop. That's how weird I am. But
Well, somebody had to keep them.
yeah, I do. Um, but when Obama came into office, there was a shift. So, would you tell us some mile markers you conscientiously could identify between the roads of your youth and the Stewart Rhodes of? Let's just stop before the insurrection era.
So the
Maybe after
main
that part.
difference
Yeah.
was environmental, really. Even before Oath Keepers, Stewart believed that he was somehow latently a threat to the deep state and the left wing conspiracy in the United States government to destroy America and overthrow the Constitution. And so the underlying paranoia and the egotism and sense of importance was the same. And this is part of
So it was always there. That part was
it
always
was
part of his matrix.
always pre-existing, and he found validation in it through
Interesting.
Oath Keepers. And
Sure.
also, this is in large part how he kept my mom hooked, which is that my mom was raised in a very old school Mormon household, and there is a particularly Mormon idea of being the helpmeet, of
Hmm.
being the wife of the, like, behind every great man, there's a great woman, being the wife
Hmm.
who reflects glory upon her husband, keeps things going in the background
Hmm.
as a spiritual figure. This is not unique to Mormonism, but it is the environment my mom was raised in.
Right.
And so Stewart was able to exploit that and inhabit of the culture she's in and exploit my mom's labor in starting Oath Keepers. And so that was one of the material factors between the Stewart of just before January 6th, 2021, and the Stewart at the founding of Oath Keepers or before,
Hmm.
is that Stewart in the last days before the insurrection is Stewart without my mom supporting him for the first time in his career as a militant and an would-be insurrectionist. The other thing was having to constantly move and reinvent himself, which is something that he took from his mother's family, from my maternal grandmother's family, especially in the religious and multi-level marketing circles that she traveled
Mm.
in Las Vegas, where she kind of
Similar to
mixed.
Amway.
Yes, I believe she was Amway,
Hmm.
where she mixed. And apologies, my voice is a little bit coming across a little bit buzzy. I'm just getting over a nasty cold. But
Me
she
too.
mixed like kind of new age spiritualist crystal fusion Christianity and multi-level marketing and real estate brokering,
Mm.
along with being a local charity organizer and radio personality. And so she had all these different interconnected hats that
Mm.
all overlapped on a personal brand that she built for herself, and everything reinforced the personal brand. And she would just move from circle to circle within Las Vegas, huge city,
Yeah.
and reinvent herself and her identity whenever it was necessary or convenient. And this included whitewashing herself for a very long time as a white passing Hispanic woman, and then going back on that. And when it became like when the inherent racism had lessened and it became something that she could work into her personal brand as a businesswoman, to be a Hispanic businesswoman without like without repercussions that were more than they were worth. She reinvented her identity and spun that in. And so this is the second material factor, is that Stewart tried to get a compound going in Trigo, Montana, in the middle of the woods, over the bridge across the river, in the old outfitter's cabin. And I blow out everybody's eardrums with my terrible lungs. And Stewart, because he wanted to get this compound going, and partially to shut my mom up about buying a house, rooted himself in one spot instead of being able to move every year and a half to 2 years and go to a different social circle entirely. Because he was stuck in the same area for upwards of 5 years, which it turns out he was not capable of sustaining.
Right.
And then the third factor here was very much something that we're seeing play out now in Trump too, is a combination of the fear of what will happen if a vengeful Democrat administration retakes control of the United States government. Vengeful, or got to think of a better word to mean intending to enforce any consequences whatsoever.
Ruthless.
Not even ruthless. Just
that's my prayer.
Oh, I don't know. Awake when you're clocked into your job. I don't know.
Yeah,
but
on task.
The fear of being in the path of retribution from a Democratic administration,
right,
coupled with Trump and Trumpism taking oxygen out of the room,
right,
for anti-government right-wing militants, and making it very hard to occupy any lane but being a pro-Trump paramilitary. Like Obama and Hillary Clinton were a heck of a lot better for fundraising than Trump was. And so that changing environment, along with the changing internet environment, where Oath Keepers, mostly through my mom's efforts, was incredibly on top of like 2009, like Blogspot era internet, and did not go on to dominate the social media platform heavy post 2010s internet to the same extent. And so you have all these factors that line up where Stewart had this brief heyday where he was able to operate at 100% efficiency as a grifter under the administration of a president that a bunch of people thought was going to be the Antichrist, the Black Muslim communist Antichrist, and being able to call upon his past criticism of the Bush surveillance state and the overreaches of the Bush administration as a fig leaf against being called racist. He was able to exist in the best of both worlds and like borrow a kind of cloak of concealment from back in the day when the Ron Paul Republican wing and the Tea Party had significant overlap on opposing foreign wars with like Occupy Democrats. And he was able to work all of these angles in a way that his childhood prepared him for very well. And then between being rooted in one spot, not being able to fall back on my mom's thankless labor for running the back end anymore, and the changing political and information environment, he was unable to adapt. And that ended up in Oath Keepers falling completely into, and Stewart personally falling completely into decline by 2020. I'm very sorry I didn't mute before doing that.
That's all right.
I was running on fumes to the end of that sentence.
More concerned that you're feeling better. If also take water if you've got some. We get time. there's a couple things that I know that I'm gonna go to Robin's question in space, which I think is right there. It was Stewart abused as a child, and talked about the dysfunctional household. What can you share a little bit more about the context of his youth that you see the most significant parts of where he became?
So, and I this is one thing where I do believe Stewart is that Stewart was abused as a child. He grew
Hmm.
up in a very strict, also very dysfunctional, uh, like poor working class Hispanic family in New Mexico and Nevada.
Hmm.
Originally a family of migrant farm workers, and there was a lot of generational trauma from severely fucked up things that happened, especially to the women in that family, that was
Mm.
carried on forward. And Stewart had no stable father figure in his life and had a rotating cast of on again, off again stepfathers his entire childhood and teenage years. I think my grandmother may have gotten divorced and remarried upwards of 10 times that I know of.
Oh.
She went in for two while she was dying of breast cancer
Mm.
right at the end, and was and the ringleader of the fraud circle that, well, no, it was her ex-husband. It was her ex-husband in the fraud that she was investigated for at the time that she was dying, where she only escaped prison because she was actively dying. Uh, that is how uh, a bunch of her co-conspirators got looped in.
Right.
And so Stewart grew up in this semi-criminal, deeply, deeply traumatized, and highly dysfunctional family environment
Yeah.
with no stability whatsoever. And as much as I hold sympathy for the child that Stewart was, he would go on to use this traumatic childhood as an excuse for all of his worst behaviors throughout his entire life without ever, ever trying to be better, and would use his traumatic childhood as a cudgel to beat people down, like in particular me, if we had any arguments or conflict, um, and guilt trip.
Hmm.
Like, how you have to understand that I had a traumatic childhood, so how could you trigger me like that by
Mm.
arguing with me or by squaring up when I challenged you to a fight in the driveway, or like by getting mad when I slapped you. And that was like the majority of Stewart's abuse in itself was psychological, because he knew that uh, going over the line into regular physical abuse would endanger like his control over my mother. So we were not physically abused to the extent that Stewart very likely was, or that I think there was just a lot of beatings with hairbrushes and belts in that family. But it was the guilt tripping over making Stewart angry enough to explode at us would last for weeks. And that was the majority of the impact of that, was just having to hear about Stewart's traumatic, neglectful childhood, and how he didn't have a father all the time. Anytime Stewart did something wrong,
Hmm.
until I became the bad guy, or whichever sibling was being targeted became the bad guy.
Yeah, and I can tell you this, I've shared this with our viewers before, that although my dad was nothing like that, and so it's such a night and day situation with my actual dad. My dad unfortunately died when I was 14, and the person who moved in with my grandmother and I behind that 15 to 17 was a fucking monster. I mean, like a monster, you know. And I was always thankful as time went on of people I knew whose monster was biological, because I always had that disconnect that this was a monster from the outside and still a monster. But I too went through with him saying, you know, what kind of kid had to grow up calling his dad Grand Dragon? Like, because I had my perspective of my own dad. My dad would never have done such a thing. You know, that my dad didn't have a house of tyranny. And although my mom was a paralegal, my stepmother was very much a Joan Crawford. So same thing, like there's this fear complex that's put in the house, you know. What next is coming that's going to set her off, or the stepsister or something, you know, the power tripping that did not exist with my mom, did not exist with my grandmother, did not exist with my dad. The three actual pretty stable figures despite their flaws. And yet this monster comes along and literally it's his. This is why I asked you earlier about your travel out of the hell pit. Is that I saw how broken this guy was when I finally hit about 16 to 17. You know, when his demands were so petty, so tiny for a 6'2" man throwing me around. I was a buck five. You know, and you know, now that I'm 56 and I see other men who've been this kind of person in the world, you know, it's sad on one level as a human. Just like if I step back objectively and go, I'm so sorry, someone like that fucking existed. Um, but we do look at their childhood in a way to go, how the fuck did you get here? Like, how did you become that? And after a while, there's no excuse for it. They still became that. Others did not.
Yeah. And
So,
there's a very basic thing that is, and there's a question from Robin White that we'll get to in just a second, I believe.
yeah, absolutely,
But
yeah.
there is this one of the books that was most useful to me, actually, to go button hook back around to that earlier point,
Hmm.
is Lundy Bancroft's Why Does He Do That? The
Mm,
kind of the Bible of the psychology of domestic abusers. In some cases, a little bit dated.
hmm.
Lundy Bancroft is not great about acknowledging that male victims of domestic abuse exist,
Hmm.
and his logic on them is very flawed. But
Hmm.
his work in working with victims and survivors and with abusive men in recovery programs is invaluable, where it was invaluable for me in understanding Stewart, but also invaluable for me in understanding that there was nothing inside me that would make me inherently like Stewart, which was one of my greatest
Understood.
fears as a
Understood.
teenager and a young man, which is that these domestic abusers have the same basic psychology as a right
Mm,
wing authoritarian. They have the same basic psychological underpinnings as somebody who joins a secret police force
hmm.
or a sexual predator on the street. In fact, they're very often the same people. The Venn diagram is an enormous overlap
Right.
of white van molester and kidnapper, secret policeman,
But you thought
and
maybe there's a chance you had a bit of this inherently that you would have to inherit
yeah,
for a while.
which
Yeah.
which was definitely fed into by the narrative that Stewart spun around himself,
Sure.
as he's just like that because of his childhood trauma, as it's something that is not his fault and is outside of his control. So you follow
Mm,
that logically, then it ends up being, what if I end up carrying this forward and it's beyond my power to control my behavior the way it's beyond Stewart's power to control his? And it turns
right.
out that is not true,
Right.
where the domestic abuser has an interior life that is very much like anybody else's. They just believe, for some reason, usually of environment and upbringing, that they're entitled to get what they want through creating a system of fear, power, and control.
Precisely.
And it is in that book, Why Does He Do That? That uh, taking refuge in childhood abuse is a very common excuse for domestic abusers because it
Mhm.
sounds right and it can, in many cases, hoodwink professionals
Mhm.
and allow them to go through couples counseling and court mandated counseling programs without taking full ownership of
Mhm.
what they have done because they can displace that responsibility. And it
Precisely.
really helped me put that into context that Stewart absolutely did not have to be the man that he was. He just reaped many benefits in his personal life from being this person, didn't want to change because he thought he was great the way that he was. But leaning on childhood abuse as a crutch, as an excuse, and as a deflection was just
Mhm.
very useful to him.
Who do you know that, as a mentor type figure? I wanna basically have the angle of him looking up to someone who would have validated that, like, "Oh, yeah, you're such a victim," or whatever, what I think of as grievance pooling, grievance, peddling, um, the kind that latch onto that or the kind that feed and foster that. Because later it's amplified in the crowd, so that's a different era, Once you get a crowd who's doing it or how Trump manipulates it, that's way up there, but I mean at the smaller level. Who do you think it was that kinda gave him the pat on the back he'd always wanted?
I can't say that I can think of an authority figure or a mentor, especially like an older, like male figure in his life. Or,
Mm.
well, no, not an
I
older
mean, the
male figure.
public sphere, how he goes out and he meets someone, and finally someone goes, "Oh yeah, man, you got it." You know.
Well, the foundations of Stewart using that childhood abuse as a permission structure were, I think, in just him trying to figure out how to use that to manipulate women. And he found it to
Mm.
be
Mhm.
that's usually that's the usual tack for domestic abusers is
Sure.
falling back on that to play to sympathy.
Mhm. Yeah.
He may have picked up on the usefulness of the tactic of playing to sympathy from his mother, who definitely played up their dirt poor and very poverty afflicted upbringing uh, as part of her brand image when it became convenient to do so. And then he just kind of carried that forward to the next most logical step for his audience because a abusive relationship is a very small cult. The
Right.
abusive family dynamic is a very small cult. And we are now seeing domestic abuser dynamics carried out on a nationwide level, which is why people who grew up
Amen.
in these environments, that's why we've been able to navigate Trump world while other people who are allegedly experts
Right.
are falling behind. And going out into the world and getting those pats on the back, it was when Stewart, as a charismatic frontman, began to be a symbol of the movement. Then
Mhm.
it became about protecting the image of the movement,
Mhm.
and people were willing to forgive any sin as long as it was we're protecting the image of the movement and what Stewart brought to the table in terms of media savvy
Mm.
and charisma.
And what were the other males of his age like, to the best of your memory? When at these musters, when I watch them, there's, like these cosplayers that are out there living their lives, and they're really into it. I mean, I've tracked these guys for a while, but all from a distance, and also not as someone part of it. The closest those guys got were my martial arts circles. You know, or maybe they were neighbor, but mostly it's a world slightly unfamiliar to me, except for like, and I think you made a great point about experts versus those who were initiated in the knowledge, but what's your read of the kind of characters they were in orbit of your dad, your of Stewart?
That is one of the things that severely declined
Hmm.
as Oath Keepers continued was the caliber of men he was able to keep around himself. The
Mm.
peak of the human capital of Oath Keepers, as
Hmm.
in like the human resources of Oath Keepers, was at Bundy Ranch, where
Mm.
in
Good
that
point.
federal standoff at Bundy Ranch, Oath Keepers expended,
Is it
and
the
in my
The
opinion,
Mayar Reserve?
no, this was pre-Malheur.
Here, yeah.
Yes, Oath Keepers was not officially involved in the Malheur except as a go-between between FBI negotiators
Ah, gotcha,
and
gotcha.
Eamon Bundy
Yeah. So it's the
inside the
previous one.
Malheur Reserve.
I remember the
Yes,
previous one too.
yes,
Right. Yeah.
Malheur was
2.0.
The Bundy son's attempt at doing his own standoff to get out of Daddy's shadow
That's right.
from the main one, which Eamon Bundy has gone on a little bit of a character arc in himself. As we get into current events, we can talk about that a little bit later.
Sure, of
But
course.
he's surprised the heck out of me, actually. But uh, Bundy Ranch, Oath Keepers rolled up to Bundy Ranch with very serious men. Oath Keepers rolled
Mm.
up to Bundy Ranch with Army infantry veterans, Marine Force
That's right.
recon,
That's
with
right.
a logistics tail, with a medical trailer, a communications trailer, like pulling on all of these connections, especially from in Montana and Idaho, to turn up with. They were the only people who showed up with organizational capacity. They showed up with logistics backing infrastructure. Everybody
Hmm.
else was just a pickup football game of guys getting into their car, walking away from their jobs at the Walmart
Hmm.
to go camp out at Bundyville. And only Oath Keepers showed up as a professional organized force,
That's right.
to my knowledge.
Hmm.
And that was a bridge too far for a lot of people in Oath Keepers. And the following, like, mini era inside Oath Keepers of Stewart latching onto this as a way to keep the money coming in, because the organization was always bottlenecked through him
Right.
to maintain Stewart's control, which is the flaw of a lot of autocratic systems and authoritarian systems, is that the inability to relinquish control by the strongman leader ends up getting in the way of the
Right.
broader mission, which we're seeing, which is what we're seeing. Like, if the strongman leader of the organization is off, allegedly burning days where he should be on the line at the standoff in Vegas brothels and going on a pill and whiskey binge
Hmm.
during the standoff, then nobody else can get anything done around him, which is very much the dynamic we are now seeing in the FBI
Yes.
played out all over again. Which, God bless Kash Patel. Long may he stay in this job position. I could not have picked a more perfect man to be Trump's head of the FBI. Like, angels watch over him, keep him hung over in that chair. But Bundy Ranch uh, kicked off this kind of like traveling preacher era of
Mm.
the history of Oath Keepers, where Stewart figured
Right.
out that all of these organizational, like, foundational necessities that had been neglected because everything was being routed through him, he could
Hmm.
compensate for by doing a kind of traveling show of
Hmm.
standoffs, armed standoffs with federal agencies to keep the donations coming in, keep numbers up. And that kept the numbers stable, even as
It's like
many old.
I call it a digital vanguard, you know.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a digital vanguard of the guy who's out here like, I'm at the barricade. I'm at the barricade of freedom for you, Bubby.
Yep. And everybody, like, you call to action
Call
gets
to
more
action. Yes.
donations, more clicks than anything else. And he kept that going for a while, but it was also causing a turnover inside Oath Keepers, where he was
Mm.
keeping some of the hardcores, but a lot of people with serious skill sets were also dropping out and being
Right.
replaced in the organizational churn by an increasing number of increasingly less qualified civilian associate members and burnouts,
Right.
where he was losing these career level men in exchange for lower level true believers.
Yeah.
And a lot of that
I
was
used to call people like that, he'd get in my face, lowest common denominator citizens, you know.
very, very much. He was increasingly surrounding himself just with, and yes, sounds just like the Trump administration, which is like the quote that's on the tip of my tongue about how fascism always ends up purging all first-rate talents from government and replacing them with
Right,
flunkies, is
right.
Stewart eventually accomplished degrading the quality of the men around him because he was creating an environment where only followers and
Mhm.
like docile, very zealous, gullible people
Right.
would be in it with him, and people who did not like the direction of the organization and saw no way to meaningfully change that and alter the course left. And by the time of the insurrection, even the very hardcore from Bundy Ranch, all those competent Bundy Ranch militants who were willing to go to the armed standoff with federal agents, had bled from the organization, and he was down to dregs. That's why he had just a bunch of weirdos, mostly from an Oath Keepers affiliate militia in Idaho, instead of a team of like former special operators. And
Yeah, when I
that
look at
was
the
that.
indictments, that brings it to a really good point about where we're going to go with where we're at, this DOJ thing. But when I read through the indictments, I had pretty good mapping of where they were located in the United States, and I found it always odd that there was only these three cells, essentially, really two, Florida and Ohio, but you had the Alabama sector there. Um, and it wasn't that there weren't people from others, but there were basically three cells of operation that came together under the umbrella to act, and that others had fallen off. So I hadn't thought about how there had been sort of an attrition from the bullshit, which I totally understand, in hindsight when you say that. But yeah, the
uh,
coordination was slightly siloed.
yes, and did I say Idaho earlier? I every time I think of militia, I think
I
Idaho.
don't know who
Yeah,
doesn't, but you meant Ohio, I think.
yeah. Well, I also just was looking at some old Oath Keepers paperwork, and there was a training field manual from the Idaho Lightfoot light
Absolutely
infantry
right.
light infantry militia in there.
Right.
And um but yeah, like as far as like the quality, like Stewart has never been able to exist. We're going to get concisely back to the question here and dial it in, within that broader context of the decline of Oath Keepers as an organization. Stewart has never been able to keep a consistent peer group of men in his own age or social status. He's never been able to maintain a group of guy friends ever.
Hmm.
He thrives in very hierarchical environments where he can have a pedestal boy that always dramatically falls from favor, who can do no wrong, kind of like the king's favorite in like
Right.
early modern Europe, Hugh Dispenser. And whether they were complete crackpots or not, like Stolen Valor, Mouse Prosen is an amazing example of that.
Hmm.
Everybody tried to warn him about that guy for months before he would stop bringing him to things. They got matching tattoos and all of it. And this is a big element of Stewart's rivalry with the Proud Boys, this very one sided rivalry, where he was
Hmm.
always jealous of, especially Gavin McInnes, and then later Enrico Tarrio getting top
Hmm.
billing at events
Because Gavin
because of
McGinnis,
their.
whether I like him or not, actually knows how to use humor. You're not going to find speeches with Stewart Rhodes that successfully use humor.
I will contest you a little bit there because I rewatched some of the old Gavin
Yeah,
McInnes clips uh, from that I had to watch as part of my homeschooling,
sure.
and uh, man, if you are not relying on the nervous laughter of pure shock factor
Hmm.
from like going up to debate a feminist and saying, I got emails that said, thank you for raping me last night, just to get bewildered, shocked laughter from the audience. Like, the funniest thing Gavin McInnes ever did was shove a dildo up his ass on a live stream to prove that he wasn't
Well,
gay. And that
what I
wasn't a
mean is,
joke.
what I'm saying is, there are some who can use the mechanics inside their own circle, and it works because they, inside that circle they have that. But then there's that guy who's worse. This is the point I was making about Stewart Rhodes. Then there's the guy who tries to do the same thing, and it actually doesn't work in the same circle. That's the point I was making.
Okay, yeah, now I get you. Yeah,
Right,
Stewart
right,
was able to use canned jokes very well as part of public speaking, and
right. That's my
while like
point. Right.
holding court and holding conversation with a large room. Um, but because he was a social chameleon who only ever copied behavior, he would
Mm,
very frequently use the wrong set of copied behaviors in the wrong
right,
circumstances,
right,
like
right.
accidentally using like the joke now is friend group A humor with friend group B, but
Right,
very,
right.
very literally using uh, bro ex-military 45, 50-year-old chud humor around extraordinarily devout, zealous Christians at a cult compound
Right.
where it did not land.
Is he in that category? Like I said this about actual ISIS leaders, all the way up to al-Baghdadi, that they weren't really religious. It was an all guys for power, and then
Very much,
they use actual zealots as the in betweeners. But in the core of that, and what really set that off for me in ISIS was there was a guy named Izzat al-Duri, and he was often seen in the Iraq War as the redheaded general, the ginger, and that's why he stuck out. But I had very little evidence to show he was a religious zealot. So I said, well, what is a general in the Ba'athist Party trying to be in the middle of thing? Like the guy who's merely the technocrat in the middle of the whole zealotry. So your read of Stuart Rhodes is he didn't have a religion, even though he'd be around these zealots, right?
very much. And Stewart, I think, has no true convictions deep down, except that Stewart has to become an important figure in American history, and
Right, right.
to be a savior figure for America. And Stewart's vision for the post-apocalypse and the vision of a lot of these militia guys sounds very similar to the kind of like semi-feudal structure that ISIS ended up running with, where your social
Yeah.
standing was defined by how many fighting men you were able to bring to the battlefield and sustain.
Hmm.
And that in the like this, they think the overstock.com guy just called it a network of warrior patronage when he was starting
Hmm.
trying to start his own version. And having this loose network of personalist warlords with their own followings in the name of some cause so that they could use zealots who are willing to sacrifice their lives in the pursuit of gaining women and territory and power. I'm sorry, I have an alarm going somewhere in this room.
Oh. And to our viewers and friends, thank you for being with us. Make sure you subscribe to Dakota's account, subscribed, and if you can do the paid subscription, please consider doing so. We have a lot more conversation, not only tonight, which we will go with you and read your comments in the space, but in the future, we're not done with this. We were talking about this with Frank Figluzzi the night about the DOJ trying to vacate the consequences of actual sedition, which we can prove happened. And then tonight we have the authority of authorities from within the own house and how things went down. Tomorrow we're going to bring on Mark Zaid to have a discussion of a different angle of that problem, plus some additional stuff that's happening with lawsuits that you probably know about, and so much more. And then April and Joy will join us on Wednesday to talk about Christian nationalism. So we're just having a whole bunch of fun around
Nothing's more fun than Christian nationalism.
here. Woohoo!
And thank you very much. I stayed off screen until you were until you were done with the bumper,
Boom,
and we're
landed.
back into it. All right. Yeah, and I want to dial in on some of these questions, because we're getting
Yeah,
onto some topics that are getting back into current events and kind of the state of things where we are. We've got some questions a little bit earlier back in the chat about
yeah.
Stewart's
Let's do
branch
it.
and rank. Stewart was enlisted in the 82nd Airborne, and he
That's right.
spent a lot of time in the hospital while he was in the army. From his personality later on in life, I suspect a lot of malingering just from what I saw as a child in the household and how he conducted himself later in life. I can't prove that, but
Mm,
it's a suspicious amount of hospitalization that very much fits the pattern that he would establish later
mm,
of malingering on injuries and milking injuries and personal life tragedy for sympathy to cover for
mm,
professional failings.
mm,
Um, so part of his instability with maintaining, and this was all before his army career was before he met my mom. He fell from a tree during a night jump training exercise, uh, a parachute drop,
mm,
and got entangled in a tree, dropped 80 feet, broke his back, had to have his back reconstructed with metal rods. And he did blind himself. That was much later while he was
oh, we'll come to
in
that.
Las Vegas.
Yeah,
Yeah,
we'll
that
come
was,
to that in case people heard
but
that
yeah,
story.
but the blinding himself was the, the short of it. My mom is the authority on that story, but the short of it is that he claims to have dropped a pistol that he was giving to a friend who was being threatened by gang members. My mom's personal theory is that he was very likely trying to run security for this friend who was also a known crack dealer and pimp
Mm,
in the time
mm,
that they were buddies. It was trying to run security for him on some kind of shady business and got shot with an unread and got shot during it, either with his own
mm,
gun or somebody else's, because unregistered firearm. But that was well after his military career, and but yeah, no, and he was a firearms safety instructor in this time span also, but he did not shoot himself in the eye while in class. A lot of media outlets have run with that because it's pithy and it
mm.
sounds like a good story, but it is not the way that it shook out. He claims that he dropped a shitty unregistered revolver and it without a drop safety, and it went off and hit him. And because the people he was hanging out with, my mom suspects that it was something else, and the drop a gun was the cover story. But yes, his military career was way in the past. However, you did hit on something that was true to life there, which is that whenever he was away doing Oath Keepers operations, these you calling them musterings, where like the mass gatherings of Oath Keepers for ceremonies or conventions, we would call them Stewartcations in the house,
Stewart
and
Cage.
they were just opportunities to like just decompress and not have to deal with the constant stress of being a walking on eggshells around Stewart and managing his
Exactly.
moods, and then eventually became the periods of time in which we would start planning the escape. Yes, and then so I'm going to be scrolling up here to make sure I don't skip over any of these questions here. And talking about question about unstable environments from Dan. This is very much a tactic of the Trump administration. Yes, uh, Stewart and Oath Keepers operated in the media environment that they were given, and after the media environment changed in the post 2010s internet, were not able to shape narratives for themselves the way that they were in like the early blog talk radio era of the internet. And so they're going to different fake or crazy episodes or events was much less successful than it had been when they were able to dictate what the thing was. Like later on, when they started getting fully involved, like Screwy Louie in the desert on the Mexican border, and getting fully in bed with all these QAnon guys and going and responding to all these militia things. Bundy Ranch, and to an extent the standoffs that followed, there was an inciting incident that they chased after, but they were creating the instability by creating the incident. And so, to the extent that they were even trying, the Obama administration and federal law enforcement were in that time period on the back foot, and the militia right and Oath Keepers were dictating the tempo and creating the unstable environment in which to operate. And part of what changed when Trump took office is that they were no longer dictating that environment. They were no longer creating the instability to their advantage, and were having to play in the same landscape of instability as everybody else. And then we have Adam P. Hunt talking about accusations of using Oath Keepers funds for personal use and people who never received memberships. Again, every time my mom stopped doing a job inside Oath Keepers, it took a team of 3 to 5 people to fail to replace her and fail to do the same job to the standard that she was. And that's part of what happened with the memberships, but also in the surviving financial records from Oath Keepers, there was a lot of cash withdrawals at the times of all these major standoffs that was never fully accounted for. A lot of gear purchases that ended up in weird caches or stored in people's houses or intermixed with Stewart's personal belongings. Like this, the Oath Keepers financials were kept deliberately opaque and incredibly complicated, very much in the same way that
I
Trump's
have the entire
campaign.
on the desktop here. I have the entire Epic server on file.
Oh, fantastic.
For those who don't know, this is what I said on Frank's conversation with me the other night. It's like in my task, you know what I did. You know what my task was. Um, the moment I find information, you collect it first, you analyze it later, you just grab it because it may disappear. And the for those who don't know, the Epic server was basically there were actually two batches. One that was kind of more Oath Keepers only, but the other one was pretty much the server. And you grab the whole server, and there's all these emails of law enforcement people, and there's a chunk of them that are like bitching about membership. Like it's all in there, man.
Yep. Yep. I was the guy in charge of responding to a bunch of those for a long time,
Right,
theoretically
right.
working for theoretical pay as a teenager under an assumed alias. But yes, that is
Oh, I read those then. I read
very
those
much
all.
true. Yeah. And yeah, that was a consistent issue, was that Stewart created a burdensome, inefficient, complicated organizational structure,
It was
in
just
my
a shell.
opinion, to facilitate graft. And
Pretty much, right, right.
it it very much got in the way of the mission, but it was opaque and blurred lines in very much the same way that Trump's campaign and the Trump organization had no true distinction between them. With Stewart the person and Oath Keepers were always enmeshed and overlapping deliberately so that you could not have Oath Keepers without Stewart in any way,
Mhm.
and to maintain that control. And so, no, you probably did not see a picture of Stewart with a hole cut in his eye patch, because I have seen Stewart with his prosthetic eye removed. There has been for my entire childhood very much an empty eye socket that was for a long time held in shape by a prosthetic eye. a glass eye that was eventually rejected when it got infected, and so now he's just rocking with the collapsed empty socket. Smells
Hmm.
like last I interacted with him, smells abhorrent at close range. I don't imagine it's gotten any better.
Hmm.
Hard to tell from the rotten breath. And very much also, Stewart definitely conducted himself as a field general and got off on the authority of ordering around men in his own age group who would have outranked him in the real
Right.
military.
That's right.
And the way that Trump says, and he says to me with tears in his eyes, and you know that he's lying.
Hmm.
Stewart telling people that people kept calling him General Rhodes, and you wish they would stop. I never
Hmm.
heard anybody say that. I heard Stewart complain about all the people calling him General Rhodes. I
Hmm.
never heard it firsthand ever. So he was just trying to get that going. He was just trying to workshop it and see if he could make General Rhodes catch on. But that was very much where we're at. And now we're getting into where you have just done an expert interview on the state of these vacated sentences, which is a distinction that I had been ignorant on before, where the exact distinction between that and a pardon and the current state of these cases in the DOJ. You
Right.
want to recap that as we get into the present day
Well,
here?
actually, one of the things is that we talked with Frank more about what went into the amount of complexity went into actually investigate to show it's not a silly effort where literally all to get to a level of sedition charges. There's an amazing amount of work that has to go in. So he came in on the investigation side, and we're going to have Glenn Kirshner on here, hopefully in the next couple of days, to talk about it from the prosecutor's side of all of the work that went through and the fact that they don't do it out of an axe grinding. They do it because the law has to apply. If the law doesn't apply, it just doesn't apply. And then tomorrow night we have Mark Zaid, who, as an attorney, has represented people in a lot of these cases that were attacked in the Capitol, etc., and showing that this is not how any of this works. Now, to the part of what actually is happening is that essentially, although it doesn't erase that they were convicted, what it does is essentially just removes all consequence of those actions in the end. And the judge that has it back, from my understanding, can decide no and then send it to the appeals court for reprocessing, which is possible from what I understand from Glenn Kirshner's last reports. And that's a prerogative that the judge can do, but also might not do, considering essentially it's you know if the executive branch comes up and says, "Well, we're not interested in holding on to it anymore," there is also there are is also court precedent that shows that the court has gone along with such requests, just not in this context that I know of. They go along with it before there's a starting point, and if it happens here, they go okay, and then there's this point, which is fucking absurd. So we're in slightly new charted territory.
Yeah. And
Oh,
my
and then
first, yeah.
returning money, which is put that on the table so I can hand it back to you. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
that this is what Frank laid out even more so is that which he had talked about in his discussion earlier that night, and then elaborated here was the 500 something dollars that each would have to pay in for restitution would be returned plus some, and that's inconceivable, as they
And
say in Princess Bride.
is there any talk of this being a potential pathway for the remaining unpardoned Oath Keepers and Proud Boys defendants, including Stewart, to be able to pursue cash settlements from the Department of Justice
Yes, yes,
for their sentences?
yes.
And so that would be the operative difference between that and a pardon. Is this an easier pathway for them to try to get those settlements without suing the Department of Justice
Well,
than if they are pardoned?
from what I understand is that the money side of it is that the government keeps sort of saying, "Sure, great idea," because currently the executive branch is completely corrupted. So unless the judge says, "I'm sorry, no, we are so outside of our norm," and some judges have done that, they have issued injunctions to say, we're not going further, which we will ask Mark if he has any read on tomorrow night. But I'm going to be very clear with our viewers, and we could do these as many as you want. We have a lot to keep on this table to raise awareness, and we'll even if Glenn isn't on here in the next couple days, Glenn Kirshner's commentary has been invaluable from a prosecutor's
Very
point of
much.
view, and we're just looking on a timing, so that will come here, so we can specifically carry this discussion in there because you're affected by it. He and the colleagues did their part of the work. Frank wasn't an agency, but Frank not only did his colleagues do it in the FBI, but I know he did the work during the that time period because I shared that report with him in summer of 2020 and said, "Hey Frank, yeah, I think you need to read the following. This is not good." And it was these particular, and actually Oath Keepers was in batch one, the anti-government militias that had different objectives that were really non-religious based. It was just kind of like the three percenters, Oath Keepers, etc. And now all this time later, we've all invested a big chunk of time in the truth, and like someone comes along and goes, "Yeah," and that wasn't in my report. The whole government would just go, "Meh."
Well,
So
that is why back before everybody involved was loyalty purged out of the DOJ,
right,
there was some talk of like people going into witness protection. And
mm,
like I told my mom that if anybody offered witness protection, that it probably wouldn't be worth it because, well, for one thing, that's a little bit extreme, but like that's my own threshold for danger being blown way out the window, where
right,
other people in this situation would probably be freaking out
hmm
who are properly adjusted. But also, who's to say that people on witness protection are safe? If like who is going to stop the Attorney General of the United States or acting Attorney General now and the director of the
right,
FBI if they show up at a secure storage site with a pry bar and start breaking into document storage on witness protection? Like,
that's
is
right,
anybody going to arrest them? Probably not. So there's a bunch of safeguards in the system that really unwisely do not account for having a completely criminal administration in charge of the
yeah,
White House and with criminal appointees in federal law enforcement and the justice system. And there were a lot of people who did not game plan what does it look like when the highest levels of power are fully taken over by a fractious criminal enterprise. Yeah.
yeah,
Only because evil people tend to be stupid have we made it this far. And that's where we're kind of leading out into the present day, which is that if Stewart gets a significant cash payout, he becomes a problem again. Like like if it's something on the order of the settlement that was awarded to General Flynn, then overnight millionaire Stewart running around with a gun legally for the first time since his conviction is a problem for me.
yeah,
Where up until now, Stewart did not receive his pardon. He got his sentence commuted. So up this whole time, he's been on supervised release, which is
hmm
a scenario that when we talked in 2023,
hmm
that uh, I did not anticipate, which is I did not anticipate a middle ground where Trump would not leave Stewart to rot in prison, but would also not put him in charge immediately of an officially sanctioned relaunch of Oath Keepers and put him in some kind of cabinet position. I did not
Good point.
anticipate this
Good
like
point.
loyalty signal, loyalty signal, like released from prison, but on a short leash and
Hmm.
frozen out of the inner circles of power,
Hmm.
where he's repeatedly begged for his pardon and showed up like a whipped dog sitting sadly in the halls of the Capitol over and
I
over
saw
again.
those videos of him complaining. What do you tell me some reactions to some of the videos that have made it to the net of him talking about like, yeah, that's great, but I didn't get him a pardon.
Well, you should know that the brown shirts get knifed. I really don't know what else to say. Stewart's like, again, this is why I think that Stewart doesn't actually learn anything instead of just copying and replaying stuff. Is if he
Right,
were capable of fully internalizing lessons of history, he would know that he was going to get long knifed at some point,
right,
or at the very least hung out to dry. He's
yeah,
not. He does. Oath Keepers didn't have top billing at the time of January 6th. The Proud Boys were Trump's favorite. They're the ones who got the shout out. Oath
yeah,
Keepers got tasked with the dirty work and failed to accomplish their objectives on the day of January 6th
hmm,
of going for the Speaker of the House in the ballot boxes, as I see it.
hmm,
And they were expended and were burned. And Stewart has just not been useful. And we're now in an environment where I think unwisely, the Trump administration has decided to go the prestige route and do a
hmm,
uniformed, masked secret police officially under Homeland Security instead of outsourcing their violence against immigrants and dissidents to deniable gray area paramilitaries like the Oath Keepers,
right,
which would have been, I think would have been the better strategy and would have provoked less backlash
right.
upon the administration itself, because ultimately they're deniable assets. You can hang them out to dry and expend them without damaging yourself. That's why autocrats love them. Autocrats love the pro leader paramilitary
That's the
and
root of
using
stochastic.
ICE.
Yeah, that's the root of my comment to Katie Tour about stochastic terrorists, which does describe both your stories that are at Jan 6 on 2015, sorry, January 5, and then who didn't go in the Capitol. When they go, oh, this should happen, this should happen, this should happen. Some idiot takes it and goes, okay, I'll do it. And then they look at, well, where are you? Well, I didn't say I was going in. Um, Trump did the exact same thing. He just basically sat back and went, "Hey, I didn't mean like attack the Capitol. I just said attack the Capitol. I said fight, fight, fight. I didn't mean like fight, fight, fight. I meant
You
like
know, I, I
fight, fight,
still meet
fight."
I still meet Republicans in complete denial that he said fight, 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 like to this day.
Right.
But no, yeah, very much. If they had kept on that track, I think it would have been working out. It would have been worse for my family personally to have Stewart in this position of power at the head of a revived, officially
Mm,
state sanctioned private army.
mm,
But I think it would have ultimately been worse for the country because it wouldn't have clearly drawn the lines and undermined and damaged the credibility of Trump, even with right wing pro Second Amendment guys, the way that this grotesque overreach by ICE has, which has resulted in cracks with fractures with right wing dissidents and
Can't
local
show up at a
police.
rally with guns.
Yeah, can't show up at a rally with guns, which that means that at all the 3% protests I went to as a teenager, especially the one where we went up on the courthouse steps somewhere, I can't remember
Hmm.
where,
Hmm.
with Mike Vandenboe in body armor with our full plate carriers and our
Hmm.
slung ARs. We had range flags in, but that was more to underscore the threat than anything else.
Hmm.
We're all on radios on our squad frequencies, and we're looking waving at cops looking down at us from the courthouse roof and on roofs of adjoining buildings. By the logic of these Trump defenders now, we should have all been gunned down on the steps of that courthouse. Can't bring a gun to a protest. So you
Hmm.
can't like to say that the ICE killings in Minneapolis were justified is the same as to say that the Obama administration should have hit Bundy Ranch with a drone strike.
Right.
Because to believe one
Is to believe the other. Right.
is to believe the other, which very few people except again Amon Bundy seem to have realized even a little bit. Ammon, excuse me. And now we're in this position of I am nervous, not just for the safety of my family, because like Stewart's attempt at suing my mom for a ridiculous sum as part of a multi-pronged effort to force my mom to interact with him in court by representing himself, but also to like extract a quick cash settlement out of USA Today, thinking that they would fold at the time when all these universities and media outlets were folding and giving Trump cash settlements.
Hmm.
He thought he could get in on that train, and they refused. And he was, I believe, too broke to afford a process server.
Right.
So right off the bat, getting back his $500 in restitution plus processing fees means that he might be able to pay a process server to finally serve this pending lawsuit that's been hanging in purgatory in the
Right.
Texas court system for about a year now.
Wow.
And a cash settlement from the Department of Justice opens the door to an entire world of vexatious lawsuits and harassments that
Well,
he'll be able to
we'll
levy
put the
against
word out
us.
right now. We'll show him how this fire works. I happen to know some really smart attorneys and smart attorneys who represent good people. I'm gonna have my friend Mark Zaid on tomorrow night. I can't conscript him, but I'll try. I live in war. I'm used to being on conscription. I live in Ukraine. We know how that works. No, but in all seriousness, to our viewers, pay attention to the message here. There are actually attorneys who go, "Oh no, 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 no! Let's show how we fight. This is how we fight."
Yes. And
So
the doom
we're gonna keep that message on the table for all of our friends. Go ahead.
and the doomer brained and the doom inclined will say that, oh, Trump ignores the laws, well, it doesn't matter. There's a limit to that, which is his flunkies have repeatedly shown that they will only go as far as their personal appetite for risk will carry them when
That's
it comes
great.
to flouting the law and court orders. And there's a lot of fear, even with promises of mass pardons for staff, that the pardons will not be honored or will be
Hmm.
dismissed, which Trump himself opened the door to with his attacks on the auto pen signed pardons from the Biden administration. And like, it's like being the queen who got the last queen beheaded. You set the precedent for yourself, buddy.
That's right.
And and also running a serious risk of ending up in a situation like Poland, where you had mass protests by judges and black
Hmm.
robe marches against the ruling party for their flouting of the rule of law. You can only undermine your legitimacy so much and stay in power. And like the
Ask
hardcore
Viktor
Trump
Orban. He
faithful,
just fucked around and found out.
oh yeah, yeah. And if Orban
16
thought that
years of
he yeah, if Orban thought that he had a chance in hell of staying in power with a judicial or military coup, he would have. And very
yeah, but
obviously, the
once
signs were
JD
not
Vance
there.
showed up, Typhoid Mary and Typhoid Mary showed up, we knew that was it. Like it was so desperate
the
that Trump
kiss,
sent
the
JD
kiss of
Vance
death.
to the kiss of death. I want to pivot to something I'm really more excited about, and this is the good news. And
Absolutely.
thank you to our friends who are here. We got 49 people paying attention right now, and some will see it on the stream. And we're going to do more of these because I think you're going to enjoy these folks. You've considered going to run in for office, and I want to talk a little
No,
bit
I
about
have
the fact
filed. I am running.
that's it. So you are running for office, and I want to talk a little bit about the job you want to take on and some objectives that are on the plate. So go. What's your pitch?
Well, I am for the second time now running up for state legislature here in Montana in Lincoln County, what was once the heart of Oath Keepers country. And we'll get back to that question about indoctrination in a sec here
Yes,
after I give
yes.
the
Okay.
stump speech. Um, and I am running for House District 1 of the Montana State Legislature for my second run, the I Know What I'm Doing This Time edition, on a platform of fixing the housing crisis and property tax crisis in Montana,
Okay.
of protecting civil rights and restoring community autonomy,
Hmm.
and of building a functioning and workable, livable state for the working class and the middle class in the last best place, instead of being run over, as Montana is now, by this tide of out of state money that is coming
Hmm.
into our politics and to buying up, frankly, all of the desirable land,
Hmm.
like on the heels of catering to billionaire migration to Montana and
Hmm.
mass marketing to the worst Americans possible through shows like Yellowstone
Ah,
to
interesting.
attempt to, and we are, there's one thing I can agree with even the most diehard right wing Montanan on, which is fuck Yellowstone.
Right.
Like that, fuck that TV show. If anybody in this audience ever visits Montana, do not wear Yellowstone, the TV show merchandise out of the airport. They will spit in your food. Nobody here likes that
I
show.
want to talk about. I want to talk about a little bit the resources that Montana has and how citizens have to be in control of what those resources do for the best of the citizens of the state itself, instead of what we know happens, which is essentially outside control takes control of those resources and then basically bills it back to the people whose resources they are that owns the
Montana
use it.
has, to begin with, some of the best wind power potential in the entire country. We
Mm,
have, and also a great deal of geothermal power potential. We have some of the most advantageous green energy potential in the continental United States, especially in the western states.
hmm.
And we have, frankly, some of the most beautiful and desirable landscapes in all of the western United States, world famous, in fact, on
Yeah.
top of endless tracts of timber and quite a bit in the way of fossil fuels. And what we're seeing now is a mass kickback scheme to thank the fossil fuel industry for supporting right wing causes
Right.
by subsidizing the failing coal industry and attempting to expand it in Montana over potentially very profitable and advantageous alternate energy, and to help keep our economy centered on resource extraction and on catering to luxury homes for the wealthy,
Right.
which really, if it's not stopped, ends at Montana becoming like the worst exploited failed states, in which the only good roads are between the resource extraction site and the border, between the coal mine, the oil well, the gas field, and the border to ship it out, and
Right.
between the homes of the ultra wealthy on their manorial estates and the airport. And
Weaving in KKP's question in a way that's about the job we were talking about doing, because her question is, our viewers can't see this, so we had to read them out. At what point did you recognize and shed the indoctrinated far right ideology? I want to weave that in for yourself to say how you will use that experience to speak to other Montanans and then and like-minded people who will obviously affect that path for you to get that in that role. So speak to both your own transformation and how that empowers you to talk to these other citizens.
yes, so I hit a point where my personal breaking point was a very odd, very niche interest for me, which was being a foreign policy wonk on the internet. And I, in particular, had been following the fight of the Syrian Kurds for autonomy and independence very closely.
Hmm.
And our complete betrayal and abandonment of the Syrian Democratic Forces
Hmm.
to Turkey and then to the advantage of Russia, it made no sense to me. It was the most boneheaded foreign policy decision in the history of the United States up until that point. We've well surpassed that by now. But that point will be different for everybody. Where right now, for a lot of people, if it was not the Epstein files, because it was possible to just not think about it or to ignore it, it was this war in Iran, which has
Hmm.
been getting to a lot of diehard conservatives that I know
Hmm.
who don't understand why we would be doing something like this, what the point is, and for what possible reason. And so, in my personal journey of that one breaking point that caused me to question part of the ideology, to begin to admit that I was wrong, and then from there, from that one single support being weakened and undermined, the weight of my personal moral convictions crushing down on the belief system that had been standing up to them became unbearable. It began to buckle. The
Hmm.
structure could no longer, the structure of falsehoods could no longer sustain itself once that one flaw began. And that is the task ahead of me.
Stephen Hassan, who you know is a cult expert, I think you know Stephen Hassan's work is. He said once he knew Dear Leader could lie, well, what else did he lie about? Kicked in, you know, and I think that's very important. It's very
It's
similar to what you're
very
saying
much
here.
so.
Yeah.
And in particular, in this race, when my family moved to northwestern Montana, it was as part of a planned and orchestrated far right takeover of
Hmm.
politics in northwestern Montana. And the wave that we were in did not succeed, but later waves did. And we came in under the strategy of taking over local institutions, local politics, and establishing ourselves in Oath Keepers in the 3% in local communities
Hmm.
to seize influence and control and pave the way for a post-American like survivalist state. And being on that side of it, and then later after leaving Oath Keepers, going into volunteer emergency services, becoming part of the community outside of militia world,
Hmm.
I understand the difference between going in to represent people and
Right.
fight for them in the halls of power and being a transplanted outsider who is coming in to seize control of a low population state for the sake of gaining political influence. We have had a plague of that in Montana, where we have had multiple state legislators, state level politicians in the nearest neighboring city who were recruited by far right organizations, one by Groypers, another
Hmm.
one is
Hmm.
involved with an armed neo Nazi group, allegedly. Were recruited to move to Montana to go up in the primaries against moderate Republicans who would not get with the program and to beat them in the qualifier rounds in the primary elections to facilitate the far right takeover of the Montana Republican Party and the vast Trump aligned dark money networks that have fueled that. And that is what I'm up against in my upcoming race, assuming that I win my little primary, because I found a primary opponent,
Mm.
and I like she's a very sweet lady and has an interesting life story, and I like her very much. Um, but presuming my win, I am up against a recent transplant who has moved to the area in the last couple of years in the post 2020 MAGA ideological transplant wave into
Mhm.
my local area, whose entire ideology seems to be that she likes Trump and she likes logging,
All right.
and that running with the correct letter next to her name will be enough to win. And maybe it will be, because there are a lot of people who, I believe there was one contractor who saw one of my debates with my opponent the last time around, who said that the performance of my incumbent opponent was saying, and that I was the one who came prepared and read and educated for the debate, and he was not, but he still had to vote for my opponent in the last round because correct party,
Correct party.
and that party loyalty stayed paramount. However, the point of the thing is to try, and I need to set this example of standing up to the far right in Montana to contest their reach everywhere,
Yeah.
and being on, having been in that world, traveled out, and understanding the difference between being an outsider seeking power and somebody wishing to serve the people is going to help me navigate this environment that we're going into. And it's a dynamic that is playing out in the national races as well, where we
Sure.
have some very dirty pool that was played elsewhere in Montana politics, both by MAGA and inside the Democratic Party, quite frankly,
The
high
Democratic
power players.
monarchy, as I call it. The Democratic
Oh boy.
monarchy.
Yes, and that is I've been deeply embroiled with, how I've been neglecting my poor, long-suffering, and beautiful, loyal Substack subscribers, is uh, this ongoing fight inside the Montana Democratic Party
Right.
to shed the slump that it's fallen into and become more than a permanent and increasingly irrelevant junior party in a one-party state, and make
Pretty
Montana
much.
purple again. And to that end, I am deeply involved in my primaries to get a abolish ICE candidate, Russell Cleveland, on the ballot for the general elections in November, where if anybody listening to this is in a potential swing district in the United States, or can support a candidate in a potential swing district in the United States, the time is now to decide whether we have a junior partner
Hmm.
in a junior partner party in an authoritarian state, or an opposition party.
Exactly.
And
And yeah, go ahead.
and that is uh, one of the lessons that I took from studying the fight against authoritarianism from other countries, that will lead back into where I think the Trump administration has been honestly screwing up until this point by not utilizing oath keepers, is, and hopefully going to continue making that mistake, is
That's right.
that um, having the opposition that is willing to fight and oppose is necessary for the critical moment when the lawmakers are climbing over the barriers. We do not need a 120th Congress that will climb over the barriers to get into the halls of Congress to agree to a bipartisan motion to condemn the protests outside that got them over the barriers, which is not too far from where we are now. And
Pretty much.
so that's why I say presuming that I win my qualifier election is
Well,
because
we believe in you. That's the reason why we're having this discussions. We have people right now, right
I
here,
appreciate
to do
your
that.
faith, because I am splitting my attention and putting a lot of my time and energy into getting Russell Cleveland, the one abolish ICE candidate in the
Yeah.
running for the Democratic nomination, onto the general ballot in November, because somehow people are not getting the program that we need to
Right.
defund, disarm, and disband the president's lawless private army if we have any
Right.
chance of this republic surviving.
Well,
And to
here's my one
set,
bit of. Go ahead.
yeah, oh,
No,
just
go ahead.
to
Oh wait.
like the example that we need to set is that there is no impunity for the security services, because what turns
Exactly.
lawless and criminal elements within law enforcement into a secret police is the feeling of impunity.
Right.
And we can't abide that. And ICE is barely old enough to rent a car in its own name in the United States. We can get rid of it as easily as we made it, and
That's
it
right.
has to be done.
Well, my question that to it's sort of like my friendly advice from the outside is that and it calls upon your skills, your experience, and what you would be doing in office is to find the Maslow's hierarchy of needs in these different people that appeal to your opponent, and then ask that rhetorically in your debate to your opponent, so that your opponent keeps leaning into the needs of those people that you have a plan for, that person has to ask the question for. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And the point of fact is that saying bring back logging to northwestern Montana, which was a cultural like corner post up here.
Right.
Also, like a lot of people's identity as a Montanan was our logging industry in this corner of the state. A lot of our sawmills shut down because they couldn't keep workers, because
Hmm.
workers couldn't afford to live here. So affordability and housing are way back
Yeah.
on the priority list before opening up those forests and getting logs going again. Logs going where? Without workers, without sawmills, without processing, it's not going to
Hmm.
do anything. It's effectively an empty platitude when
Right.
the basis of it is protecting civil rights, keeping people being able to live in this state instead of being forced out and forced to go somewhere else where they can make a living instead of fighting as hard as they can just to tread water, and investing in a future for everyone in Montana and not just the catered to ultra wealthy. And you
Yeah,
can't get
exactly.
there by saying just bring back logging, even though it sounds good and simple as a slogan. And
Well,
point
and
of fact,
my article yesterday was the government can't afford you 5 counts, the indictment in 5 counts, and it's essentially I heard one too many times, what Trump and his associates say they can't do for common Americans, but they've got an arch. They've got a war. I mean, you can do all
yeah,
this shit
we've
that they're
got
throwing at you,
ballroom
but they
money.
can't take care of you. Like, okay, well, I'll take that message and run with it. The
Yeah,
government
can't
can't
or
afford you,
won't.
okay, or won't afford you. Exactly.
Because if we have the money to burn Patriot missiles for fun, just to see them explode in the atmosphere,
That's right.
then we have the money for healthcare. And in Montana, that looks like no longer, yeah, we have war money, we have money for
Unless
everything
it,
else.
unless it's to help Ukraine where I live, then all of a
Yes,
sudden we can't do it.
yes. And that's like we have unlimited resources for a war of choice going in on behalf of a genocidal ethno state, but none for a country that we are treaty obligated to defend in exchange for their nuclear disarmament, which
That's right.
is again get in your primaries and support, like I am, support a candidate who will has the common sense opinion of no more stupid wars in the Middle East, but also hold to our word on supporting Ukraine, because it was not that long ago that you couldn't find anybody who was capable of holding those two truths simultaneously, especially
Hmm.
not in the DSA, where that's like it's a leftover weird Assadist hangover and
Hmm.
like compulsory Russophilic baggage that we're finally dropping. And there's basic common sense opinions that you need to find in your people to support for local office to build the Democratic Party in the United States into a true opposition party. And that is abolishing ICE, and we're fighting it on the local level to the last tooth and nail,
Hmm.
and to be against foreign wars and adventurism and in for protections for peace protesters, but also against tyrants and for keeping our word. And
That's
we
exactly
can
it.
do both.
Well, brother, I believe in you, and I want to thank you for jumping on here with us. And we're going to have to do this a lot because shit's getting crazy. And like I said at the beginning of our program, and thank you for everyone who's here right now. At the beginning, I said I did a digital update of my uh, summer 2020 Boog threat report. And the main thing it said there is like there's a gap in here where you didn't anticipate that the DOJ will just like roll it all back, like the state failure, and it's not hard to see, and we have a lot to learn from how you see this evolving, because like I said, tomorrow we'll have Mark Zaid on, an attorney who knows this from another angle of defending some of the police officers who were in Jan 6. And then we'll wait to see one, the court decision. So I hope when we get the court decision like we did when Stewart went to jail. We'll come back in here doing an update for everybody. Everyone should be following your account, and I'm going to put out a call to everyone because we just got to 1,010 subscribers on the wiretap. Thank you for everybody. And
Congratulations.
yeah, thank you. And then same thing I want to say for Dakota's account, because yes, you weren't here, but you will be. Therefore, we got to get your account above 1,000, so everyone's paying attention. So your position papers are announced here, and it's really really useful. And I'm going to say it this way as a form of in your face compliment, because I've seen you grow. I really like who you are as a person when I see you. Like we're friends outside of this conversation, and I can see everything from like the shorts that you share and certain world priorities that come out. And I see there's a good ability on your side to articulate a part of America that is what will save us, I believe, and I don't mean just save Americans, but can save the world if we speak to that side. And it's sort of the point of KKP's question of where you changed in a radicalization process, growing up in it and then evolving past it and then just being yourself. You're very much, you're not a clone of something else. You're very you. We need that.
And I had a question about last name and handle. It's Dakota Adams, and my handle is Dakota V Adams all across the internet. You can find
That's
me,
it.
and there's a website with a link tree as well. And then when I have my updated donation links and everything for the political campaign, that'll be up there. And I want to thank you also for everyone listening, but also thank you for really, I got a little bit of a slap in the face from your piece
Mm,
about on the retrospective from our 2023 conversation, where I had felt the temptation to not attack Stewart publicly anymore and just avoid the conflict. Just like a
mm-hmm.
lot of people feel the temptation to stay quiet and not make themselves a target. And I got hit in the face with my own words from 2023, and I had to hold up to my own past ideals. And
Mm,
I had to be consistent in what I am publicly and what I do, where it is one thing to oppose the resurgent uniformed neo-Nazi street gang that we have going uh, in my county right now, that
yeah.
attempted to infiltrate my fire department very recently. It
Yeah.
is one thing to oppose out of state transplant politicians serving the MAGA agenda, like the well connected far right talk show host that was handpicked by Trump to run for Congress in Montana. It's one thing
Mm,
to oppose groypers in the state legislature and everything else. and to get in between uh, self-described Christian nationalist and like card-carrying, dues-paying Proud Boys trying to agitate fights at No Kings protests. But it is also important to practice taking the risk of saying out loud, fuck that guy, fuck that guy who is trying to control my life or my country through
Yeah.
systems of coercion, violence, and intimidation and fear. And to practice saying, fuck you, fuck your secret police, fuck your thugs, fuck Stewart Rhodes, fuck the Proud Boys, because you want to practice flexing that muscle for the day when you really need it. And
Amen.
I believe you were leading into an outro there, so I won't hold on to you very much longer there.
Oh, well, I mean, I enjoy having this conversation as much as possible. I did find one thing with Substack. It gets mad when we go 2 hours plus. Like the audio part or whatever, when it ports over to the
It
YouTube
starts.
land and does its
Yep.
digital algorithmic thing. But also, I think that our friends digest really good conversations. And then when it evolves, like tomorrow, we'll have Mark Zaid back, who've had him before. And it'd be a whole different conversation than last time we had because things keep changing. And I have no doubt things are going to keep changing, and we're going to need to have this conversation in the updated form. I will say, on behalf of those viewers who know this from our past Twitter space, we wish big loyalty to you and friendship to you. And then also, your mom is a friend who I care about, and same thing right back. Solidarity.
Solidarity
Come up,
forever.
here and speak up when you hear something. And then as we get this decision coming out of court, feel free to come along, and we're going to put that information up here on the Substacks.
On the Substacks.
All right, man. Big love to you. Work hard. See you soon. Let me know what you need too. We're here for you.
All right, I will
And
see you
to
soon. Thank
and
you.
to everyone else, join us at 4 p.m. East Coast time tomorrow night with Mark Zaid. Then on Wednesday we'll have April Joy on here, and I will keep you posted on when we'll have Glenn Kirshner on to talk about the prosecution side of what's happening with the DOJ. New articles will come out today. We had Hal Lindsey article. We have the article about Bulgaria, and then we'll have something that comes out every day because it's the only way to keep my fucking sanity. Until then,
Yes.
Slava Ukraini, Heroim Slava, i Pizdets, Rosyska Federata, i Pizdets, Stewart Rhodes.